The ceiling of a Sikorsky CH-53 transport helicopter is suddenly sprayed crimson. A Montagnard commando crumples to the floor. Through the deafening cacophony of whirring turbines and rattling gunfire, a hoarse cry alerts the crew to what they already know. They're under attack. As North Vietnamese Army rounds continue to punch through the helicopter's paper-thin aluminum skin, it lumbers on through the chaos with dogged determination. Alongside its two fellow CH-53s, it's taking 16 Green Berets and their 110 Montagnard allies further into Laos than any special ops team has ever dared to go before. As the helicopters descend on the landing zone, their 12 Marine Cobra escorts lay down white phosphorus in a desperate attempt to mask them from the relentless torrent of anti-aircraft fire. The men on board nervously exchange glances. With next to zero intelligence, they have no idea what could be lurking in this uncharted territory. The next phase of Operation Tailwind is about to begin. Background and context. At Kontum Special Forces Base in September 1970, Captain Eugene McCarley surveyed his strike force. Described by Special Forces veteran and historian Major John L. Plaster as, quote, built like a stevedore, but with a small-town demeanor, the seasoned Green Beret commander had handpicked each of his 16 American troops. Together with fighters from the U.S. allied indigenous mountain tribes known as Montagnards, they formed an elite SOG hatchet force, the U.S. military's secret weapons for the most dangerous missions of the Vietnam War. But even by SOG standards, this operation was different. The CIA's war in southern Laos was unraveling. North Vietnamese forces had seized the strategic Bolivan Plateau, overrunning several forward bases. 2 battalions of CIA-supported Hmong tribal fighters were desperately trying to recapture the strongpoint. Yet, according to the senior CIA officer who had come to Bangkok to explain the situation to SOG High Command, they were, quote, getting the bejesus kicked out of them daily. After describing the ailing unit's struggle to SOG Commander Colonel John Sadler, the CIA officer made an unprecedented request for McCarley's raiders to penetrate 60 miles into enemy territory, far beyond their authorized operational zone, and draw the North Vietnamese away from the beleaguered Hmong. Before long, the hatchet force was being briefed on their perilous mission. Operation Tailwind would take them deeper than any American force had ever gone, into mountains bristling with anti-aircraft guns and swarming with enemy troops. Even getting there seemed impossible until 3 massive CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters were sourced from a Marine squadron in Da Nang. By September 10th, the force was almost ready to move out. As his men prepared their weapons and equipment at the staging area in Dak To, McCarley studied the blank spaces on his map where their target lay. There was no intelligence, no reconnaissance. They were flying blind into one of the most heavily defended sectors of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam's secret supply route to the south. That night, as the commandos contemplated the uncertain days that lay before them, the silence at Dak To was shattered by the screech of incoming rockets. NVA rounds slammed into the staging area, one scoring a direct hit on a Cobra gunship. Marine door gunner Larry Grote later said, quote, there was basically no cover for us to run to, as our choppers were the target of the attack. The message was clear. The enemy knew they were coming. It seemed the odds were stacked against the hatchet force. Captain Gary Mike Rose, at that time sergeant and the group's only medic, feared the worst. He later said, quote, we weren't given much chance for survival. The operation begins. At first light the next morning, the battered assault force lifted off. As they crossed into Laos, the full scale of enemy defenses became apparent. Heavy machine gun fire raked the helicopters from concealed positions, piercing through the Sea Stallion's flimsy exteriors and badly wounding several of the Montagnards inside before they even made it to the ground. All the while, the distinctive sound of telephones ringing echoed through the valleys. The NVA's early warning system was already alerting their forces lurking among the trees. Though most of the Marines lacked experience with cross-border operations in Laos, known as Mission 72s or going over the fence, their courage under fire was extraordinary. As North Vietnamese anti-aircraft guns roared to life, Marine Cobras laid down gunfire to suppress enemy positions, as well as curtains of white phosphorus, the burning chemicals providing a smokescreen for the vulnerable CH-53s. When the lead helicopter finally touched down, McCarley's men didn't even wait for the ramp to fully lower. Shaken up from the rough ride in, they burst from the aircraft's belly into the sweltering Laotian jungle, gripping their weapons tightly. Following the sound of the enemy telephone lines, within minutes, they were already engaging their first NVA squad. After a brief firefight, the North Vietnamese soldiers vanished back into the dense vegetation. But they had left behind something far more significant than just spent cartridges. A mere quarter-mile from the landing zone lay a 500-yard line of earthen bunkers. Inside, the commandos found thousands of 6-foot-long rockets, an arsenal meant to rain destruction on American bases 100 miles away in Da Nang and Tu Lai. Specialist 5 Craig Schmidt and Sergeant First Class Jim Breville worked quickly, laying demolition charges in each of the 20 bunkers. The 2 demo men linked the buildings with detonation cord, dual priming them with time delay fuses. When the charges blew 30 minutes later, the ground shook with the initial blast. Then came the secondaries, explosion after explosion, as thousands of rockets began to cook off. In the words of John Plaster, quote, "The prettiest music a Special Forces demo man can hear." Round 2. The noise inevitably drew the attention of the NVA. A platoon-sized element suddenly materialized and began engaging the commandos in a fierce firefight. McCarley called in fire support, pounding the enemy positions before pushing his men westward. But the hour-long shootout had taken its toll, and with several men wounded, the team set about securing a landing zone for medical evacuation. Yet before the medevac helicopter could reach them, another 150 North Vietnamese troops launched an all-out assault on their position. Forced to abandon the evacuation attempt, the Green Berets and their Montagnard allies fought desperately to hold the fresh attack. Fortunately, AC-130 gunships soon came to their assistance, pushing the enemy back into the jungle. With the men exhausted from the day's relentless action, most commanders would have dug in for the night. But McCarley knew that staying put would mean certain destruction. Instead, he kept his ravaged force slowly moving through the darkness, those who could walk carrying those who couldn't, while Medic Sergeant Rose worked tirelessly to patch up their injuries. Each time they encountered the enemy, McCarley would call in air support, adjust his route, and press deeper into enemy territory. By dawn of the second day, even with 9 of the 16 Americans and many Montagnards wounded, they had successfully penetrated further west than any U.S. unit before them. John Plaster explained, quote, "The farther they marched, the bigger a threat they posed, and the better they performed their diversionary role." Tailwind intensifies. As the morning wore on, McCarley strove to keep his weary men off the main trails, leading them along stream beds and ridgelines to keep the enemy guessing. Yet, when they reached an elevated position overlooking Highway 165, the true scale of what they faced suddenly became clear. Below them stretched a scene that made even hardened SOG veterans pause. Hundreds of North Vietnamese troops were moving in long columns along the road, accompanied by a convoy of supply trucks. Demolition specialist Craig Schmidt later described the risk, quote, "From the amount of men I saw on that road, if they ever really knew where we were at, they could take us out." McCarley didn't hesitate to call in the Sky Raiders. The A-1 strike pilots, led by Air Force Major Art Bishop, swooped in low through the valleys. Their bombs and rockets tore into the convoy, sending trucks exploding into the air and scattering NVA infantry into the jungle. But the defenders quickly regrouped, and soon, mortars began falling around the hatchet force. With over 24 wounded now hampering their movement, McCarley knew they badly needed the evacuation they'd been denied the previous evening. Soon enough, a CH-53 appeared from the heavens, battling through heavy fire to touch down. But just as the Air Force medics on board reached for the first casualties being carried forward by Sergeant Rose, the enemy gunfire suddenly reached a crescendo, forcing the pilot to pull away. As the helicopter banked right, the NVA gunners found their mark. An RPG streaked through the air, punching straight through the CH-53's belly. Inside, high-octane fuel sprayed across the cabin. The rocket had passed straight through a gas tank, but, miraculously, failed to detonate. The stricken CH-53 limped 5 miles before being forced down near another bunker complex. Within 20 minutes, a second helicopter arrived to rescue the crew, but immediately came under devastating fire from 51 caliber machine guns. Both aircraft were now out of action. The hatchet force was certainly accomplishing its purpose of distracting the NBA, but with 2 Marine helicopters lost and a rapidly growing number of casualties, the cost of the mission now seemed it might outweigh its benefits. The Discovery. Captain McCarley pushed his men onward, just managing to stay one step ahead of the NBA forces. By the third morning, the sound of combat had drawn enemy battalions from miles around. When the point squad engaged a small enemy group, the commandos found themselves drawn into a frenzied firefight for a North Vietnamese bivouac. After airstrikes softened the position, McCarley ordered an assault. His men burst into a battalion-sized base camp, eliminating the last pockets of resistance. 54 lifeless enemy soldiers lay strewn around the site. But it wasn't until the Green Berets discovered a bunker buried 12 feet underground that they realized the true significance of what they'd found. The men rushed into the cavernous chamber. As they surveyed the room, their eyes widened. The walls were covered in detailed maps. Footlockers overflowed with documents. The men looked at one another in disbelief. Without even meaning to, they had stumbled upon the nerve center controlling all North Vietnamese operations along Highway 165, a vital artery of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But there was no time to analyze what they'd found. The commandos frantically filled their rucksacks with as many papers as they could. The Exit, Part 1. Meanwhile, from reconnaissance aircraft, forward air controllers could see NBA units converging from 2 directions. The maps and documents they'd captured were clearly of great value. The enemy seemed determined to prevent the commandos from escaping with them at all costs. All 16 Americans had now been wounded to some extent, many multiple times. Medic Sergeant Rose had been hit twice himself, but continued moving from casualty to casualty, doing whatever it took to keep his men alive. Captain McCarley realized they needed to get out of there, fast. Weighing up the odds, he made the bold decision to split the force into smaller groups for the evacuation. But even reaching their designated landing zones would mean running a gauntlet of enemy fire. As the first CH-53 touched down, several A-1 Sky Raiders surged over the treetops to offer protection. Air Force First Lieutenant Tom Stump repeatedly put his aircraft between the enemy and the extraction point, diving beneath low clouds and between jungle-covered hills to deliver his payload of napalm and cluster bombs. Stump's strikes against the waves of advancing NVA troops allowed the commandos to rush their wounded to the Sea Stallion and earned him a Distinguished Flying Cross. The precious intelligence haul was hurriedly loaded on board the helicopter, along with the men in most desperate need of medical attention. But as it lifted away, enemy mortars began pounding the landing zone. F-4 Phantoms responded instantly, their napalm canisters creating a wall of fire between the Special Forces men and their pursuers. Rather than get pinned down, McCarley led his remaining men to another clearing. The Air Force dropped CS gas to temporarily blind the NBA gunners, but shifting winds blew the chemicals back across the landing zone. Through watering eyes, the commandos watched their second CH-53 hover overhead. Yet by now, hundreds of North Vietnamese troops were streaming out of the hills, mounting an almost constant barrage. McCarley's dwindling force was down to its last 40 men. Each time they attempted to reach a landing zone, the enemy would close in with devastating firepower. As they fought their way toward yet another potential extraction point, spent ammunition littering their wake, McCarley received a worrying message. Get out now, or prepare to start evading. The last helicopter was running critically low on fuel. The Exit, Part 2. With enemy fire intensifying and time rapidly running out, McCarley made one final, desperate gambit, leading his remaining men towards a distant field of elephant grass. Behind them, the distinctive drumbeat of North Vietnamese automatic weapons grew ever closer. Help was on its way. As the beleaguered hatchet force raced to the field, the sky filled with American aircraft, dumping nearly 500,000 pounds of bombs, rockets, and napalm. Through clouds of smoke and combat gases, McCarley's men stumbled into the elephant grass. The thick 6-foot-high vegetation offered concealment, but it would also provide perfect cover for the remaining NVA troops to close within grenade range. McCarley prayed the helicopter would make it before its tank was empty. Suddenly, the sound of rotors cut through the chaos. A lone CH-53 appeared through the haze, its Marine crew pushing through the persistent gunfire to reach the surrounded commandos. As rounds sparked off its hull, the massive aircraft settled onto the grass. The rugged band of survivors didn't need orders. They scrambled towards the helicopter as quickly as they could, the most badly wounded carried by those in slightly better shape. As NVA machine guns continued to blast the extraction point, the helicopter's door gunners responded with their M60s, where muzzle flashes gave away enemy positions. Captain McCarley counted each man through as they hurriedly climbed aboard, only joining them when the last of his force was safely inside. As the helicopter's engines strained to lift the heavy load, enemy fire reached a crescendo. But try as the North Vietnamese might, there was no stopping the Hatchet Force's escape from Laos. Aftermath and legacy. 3 Montagnards had lost their lives, while 33 had been wounded, along with all 16 Americans. 2 CH-53s had been lost. Yet, against extraordinary odds, what had been intended as a diversionary mission had managed to achieve far more. The 400 pages of captured documents provided what Major General Potts, head of intelligence of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, called, quote, the most significant collateral intelligence on the Ho Chi Minh Trail since the beginning of the war. For the first time, American commanders truly understood the scope and sophistication of the trail network. 2 weeks later, the Marine helicopter crews flew to Kon Tum to celebrate with the men they'd saved, with the commandos buying the rescuers drinks all night to thank them for heroically bringing them to safety. Demolition specialist Craig Schmidt commented, quote, I can't say enough about those guys. They were great. In the following decades, Operation Tailwind remained classified. When it finally came to light, controversy quickly followed. A 1998 CNN report alleged that illegal sarin nerve gas had been used by US forces during the mission. Military investigations ensued, but when they found that only tear gas had been deployed, the story was retracted. In 2017, Operation Tailwind's true legacy was finally recognized when Gary Mike Rose, the lone medic who had saved so many lives while wounded himself, was awarded the Medal of Honor at the White House 47 years after the mission had taken place.